Good morning. Today we're going to speak about Tolstoy. He was born in 1828 and he died in 1910. But before we begin speaking about Tolstoy, let me just bring up a few interesting things that connect and at the same time mark a difference between the author we saw on the previous lecture, Dostoevsky, and the author we're going to see today, Tolstoy. Of course, they both are the greatest titans of Russian literature, so they share a lot of things in common. Both lived in a time of political and social upheaval in Russia, intense cultural and intellectual changes, although none of them lived to see the Russian Revolution, but the culture and the background that was leading to that revolution was already there. So they both lived to see that. They both explore the human condition, the sense of morality, good and evil. Furthermore, they sometimes lived even in the same cities, even if they never met. And of course, they knew each other's works. Tolstoy was harsh and critical of the work of Dostoevsky, even if after Dostoevsky died, he rehabilitated him and he started praising his work, but only after Dostoevsky's death. So, of course, there are many things they share in common, but I think it's even more interesting to see how they differ. First, Tolstoy, of course, these are schematisms, but follow the schematism, realizing the part of truth that there is, and don't try to caricaturize things. Okay? So I'm going to say things that are schematic. For example, Tolstoy delves into social and political themes. Dostoevsky instead delves into psychological questions. What am I saying here? Am I saying that Dostoevsky has nothing to do with social and politics? No. Am I saying that Tolstoy never delves into human psychology or introspection? No. You get it? But overall, we see that the interest of Tolstoy leans a lot more towards social and political themes, whereas the interest of Dostoevsky leans completely towards psychological issues. Is this clear? So there's a difference between the two of them. In addition, these are schematisms because they both evolve during their lifetimes, and you can see different themes throughout the course of their lifetimes. But overall, if you want to get a panoramic view, you are safe when you say that Tolstoy delves into social and political themes, whereas Dostoevsky delves into into psychological issues. So there's a first important difference between the two of them. Then, their religious views. Both of them were raised in the Russian Orthodox Church. However, they evolved very differently. And toward the end of his life, in Tolstoy, we find someone who's very mature and brings up a philosophy and spirituality of non-resistance, pacifism, asceticism, even anarchism, inspired on the Sermon of the Mountain. Instead, Dostoevsky, he's a lot darker about his views, but nevertheless, he also looks for redemption. So that's a constant. His views are a lot darker, but he looks for an answer to those existential aspects of the soul's search for meaning. Another remarkable difference. Tolstoy was an aristocrat. And his characters, all of them belong mostly to the aristocracy. Right? Instead, Dostoevsky is among the common people who often struggle with poverty, with crime. He himself had financial struggles. He was imprisoned. He was sent to a forced labor camp. So their life experiences were very different, and their characters are also very different. So one might argue, well, but Tolstoy himself writes about God sees the truth but waits, and there we find someone who's imprisoned, right? Yes, and someone who dedicates himself to making boots, which is an autobiographical trait of Tolstoy, because Tolstoy also dedicated himself to making boots. So he also had to work with his own hands, right? Yeah, because he was rich enough to afford that. So he was rich, and he wanted to see how it felt to experience the life of a commoner who made boots. Yes, because in his view of asceticism and pacifism and non-resistance, yes, he wanted to experience that because he was wealthy enough to experience that, not because he was compelled by any need. Their narrative. Tolstoy's narrative is expansive. It's a panoramic narrative. He leaves no gaps in what you want to see. Instead, with Dostoevsky, we find a very intense psychological introspection. The surroundings are mentioned, but are definitely not as important. What really matters to Dostoevsky is that intense psychological introspection. Additionally, this is a very important trait and a very important difference, and I'll come back to this. Tolstoy wrote and rewrote his work. He reviewed and corrected War and Peace, depending on the edition, but it's something like 1200 pages. He wrote it 7 times. So he wrote it, cross out, okay, now I'm going to come up with a final draft. He read his final draft, he was not satisfied, so he crossed, he changed, he crossed, he changed. He came with a 3rd draft, and so on. 7 times. He had to write War and Peace 7 times. Dostoevsky instead never had time to correct his work. He never reviewed a single line he wrote, which is impressive. I'm not familiar with the original Russian, but in the translations, things flow so smoothly, and I find it very impressive that a man could just from his first burst of inspiration pen down those great paragraphs and that very intricate narrative. Dostoevsky never reviewed his work. Tolstoy over-reviewed it. In Tolstoy, the spiritual becomes so ethereal that it dissolves any structure of organized religion. Maybe even it even dissolves any intellectual quest. Instead, in Dostoevsky, we find that very, very intense intellectual quest. How he grapples with doubt. And when we find the atheist in the character of Ivan or in the character of Raskolnikov, he does not present a straw man. He does not present a weak version of atheism to refute it, but he actually presents the strongest version he can find of atheism and confronts it with his own internal quest. Okay? With that being said, let me now delve into the life of Tolstoy. He was born in 1828, and his parents died when he was still young, so he was raised by close relatives. In 1844, he started attending college. He studied law and Oriental languages. His professors described him as unable and unwilling to learn. He got into debts with gambling, and trying to escape this environment, he joined the army in 1851. What was happening in the world stage during this time?
No, the
Crimean War. Napoleonic War, no. Crimean War. And he participated in the Crimean War, and he received an honor, some kind of honor because of his outstanding bravery, so he was promoted. Inspired in these events, he would write a novel, well, actually a three-part novel, a trilogy, which is an autobiography that deals with his childhood, boyhood, and youth. So those are the titles of the three parts: childhood, boyhood, and youth. This trilogy was published between 1852 and 1856. 1857, he visited Paris. And it is then when his views started changing. He was very influenced by the Sermon of the Mountain. Excuse me. He was very sympathetic to anarchistic views. If you remember your studies of history, Bakunin and Kropotkin, those are names that might ring a bell. They were anarchists, and they were influenced just like he was. So he started leaning toward a Christian anarchism and a Christian pacifism. This would be a long evolution. And you would say that he was fully himself in the 1870s. But it all started here in Paris. In 1860, he met Victor Hugo. He also met the socialist Joseph Proudhon. I don't know if you've heard his name, but it's Proudhon or Proudhon. He had written a work called La Guerre et la Paix, which means War and Peace, which of course would inspire the great novel by Tolstoy. After he returned to Russia, he dedicated himself to serving the poor, and for this purpose he founded 13 schools. And he settled in his estate of Yasnaya Poliana. He married Sofia Andreyevna, who gave him 13 children, of which 8 survived to adulthood. During this time, Tolstoy suffered an anxiety crisis. In his memoirs, which he published with the title of Memoirs of a Madman, he describes these things with the following words: "Explosions inside me caused me unspeakable terror. Something inexpressible was shattering my spirit, yet not completely. Something tearing me apart without tearing me apart. It was harrowing painfully, sharp and awful." In 1869, he published War and Peace. In its time, it was not received as a novel. Of course, now it's regarded as a novel, but in its time, it was so innovative, so unconventional, so disruptive with the habitual schemes, that it was received more like a social commentary or a political commentary in which 580 characters, some of them fictional, some of them historical, intertwine. And I am putting the pieces together. So this is my own personal conjecture. Okay? It's my speculation. I might be wrong, but I might be right. His marriage was a very troubled marriage. He and his wife didn't get along. For example, when I was studying the biography of Rilke, the great poet in German language, he got to visit Tolstoy, but he couldn't visit him, he couldn't see him. He had to stay outside of the house because he and his wife were quarreling and throwing plates at one another. Okay. Now, the question here is, why? On the one hand, it was Tolstoy's ascetical views. He wanted to live like a hermit. Instead, his wife was used to her aristocratic lifestyle. That might have been very well one of the reasons for their quarreling. But I think there's another reason way more profound. She was Tolstoy's editor. She was Tolstoy's editor. And at the same time, she was raising 13 children. So imagine this poor woman. Tolstoy wrote and rewrote War and Peace. Good for him. But did he write it all with his own hand and with his own pen? Or did he enslave poor Sophia to write and rewrite War and Peace? So this is a personal conjecture, but it might not be very far from the truth. So I am putting the pieces together. I have heard things and reports from here and from there. Maybe this was one of the causes for their quarreling. Because we know for a fact that Sophia was his editor and that she had to write for him. So maybe she had to write the whole thing, War and Peace, 7 times, and Tolstoy wrote and corrected. Okay, now here you are again. This is again the conjecture, but if it's not completely true, maybe there's some part of truth to it, right? So this might help us understand what was going on. After he published War and Peace, he dedicated 7 years to Anna Karenina. And by the way, he would dislike his own work. But nevertheless, he dedicated 7 years to working on Anna Karenina. During this time, he also wrote the stories that you have in the anthology. God Sees the Truth But Waits, and The Prisoner of Caucasus. Both of those short stories were written during this period where he was coming to full maturity with his Christian views, with his policies of non-resistance, with his sympathy toward the barbarians, the Tartars, yes, and so on. After he finished Anna Karenina, he dedicated himself completely to Christian themes. He didn't like his own work of Anna Karenina because he regarded it as immoral, but nevertheless, he published it, emphasizing and exalting the figure of Count Levin, and that is Tolstoy himself. You can even see the resemblance between their names, Leo Tolstoy and Prince Levin. So he's the moralizing character in the novel, and that is why he agreed to have it published. But nevertheless, he was never proud of Anna Karenina, and he dedicated himself to Christian themes, such as the death of Ivan Ilyich and anarcho-pacifist Christian doctrine, which he published in 1886. What I Believe, which is a confession he wrote in 1884. It's a confession of his Christian beliefs. The kingdom of God is within you. It's a criticism of the hierarchical church. So he endorsed a literal interpretation of the gospel, especially of the Sermon on the Mountain, and that is why he was also very contrary to any authority, including that of the church. For this reason, in 1901, he would be excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church. 1901, yes. 1901, he was excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church. This work I just mentioned, The Kingdom of God is Within You, was also very influential for Martin Luther King Jr. and for Gandhi. Actually, he and Gandhi corresponded. They exchanged letters. Oh, please rewind a little. I forgot to mention something important about War and Peace. How did he end up writing this novel? He wanted to write about a former dissident who returns from a Siberian gulag in 1856. Makes sense, right? Do you find any mention of that in the novel? No. So he wanted to write about this theme, but he says to himself, "Oh, if I want to write about this former dissident who returns from Siberia and is trying to be reincorporated to Russian social life, I need to explain, first of all, why he went to the Siberian gulag, right? He had to explain that. But to explain why he had gone to the Siberian gulag, he needed to explain why he was a dissident to begin with. And to explain why he was a dissident, he had to explain the authoritarian regime. But to explain the authoritarian regime, he had to explain the Napoleonic invasion. And then he claimed the Napoleonic invasion would have taken place had it not been for the policies of the Tsar after Austerlitz. And to explain Austerlitz, the battle which took place in 1812, I need to explain what was happening before that. So, he starts his novel explaining what happened before Austerlitz. And he continues writing, and he ends up writing he finishes his novel in 1826. That is 36 years before the return of the dissident. So he never got to write what he really wanted to write. So what we have in War and Peace is the introduction to the theme that would support the theme, that would support the theme, that would support the theme he actually wanted to write about. Okay. After he was excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church, he still wrote a few essays, especially about his own Christian beliefs. And in 1910, after a quarrel with his wife, he left. It was in the dark of the night, and it was during the winter. He was already 82. So you can imagine his condition was frail, and the cold got the best of him. So he died of pneumonia in the station of Astapov, aged 82. There were long lines of peasants, in spite of the Russian authorities trying to prevent them from coming to honor him with a major funeral. But lots and lots of peasants whom he had benefited came over. Of him, let me speak a little about his legacy. For example, Anton Chekhov said, "When literature possesses a Tolstoy, it is easy and pleasant to be a writer. Even when you know you have achieved nothing yourself and are still achieving nothing, this is not as terrible as it might otherwise be, because Tolstoy achieves for everyone. What he does serves to justify all the hopes and aspirations invested in literature." Arthur Conan Doyle. "I am attracted by his earnestness, by his power of detail, but I am repelled by his looseness of construction and by his unreasonable and impracticable mysticism." James Joyce. "He is never dull, he is never stupid, never tired, never pedantic, never theatrical." Thomas Mann. "Seldom did art work so much like nature." And during his lifetime, Fyodor Dostoevsky regarded him as the greatest living novelist. And let me see what else. Oh, yes. And of course, he leaves an immense legacy. Besides the works I've already mentioned, and the great novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina, there are hundreds of plays, philosophical essays, and especially in the beginning of his life, he also attempted to write some poetry. Even if he was not very fond of poetry, and he criticized, for example, the poetry of Pushkin, and in general poets who try to fit the lines and make them rhyme. But we also have some poetry written by Tolstoy. So this is in broad lines. This is the life and the work and the thought of Tolstoy.